There exists a threshold between worlds, a gossamer membrane where the rational mind surrenders its grip and deeper currents begin to flow. In the small town of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, a man named Edgar Cayce discovered this sacred portal not through ancient rituals or mystical practices, but through the simple act of closing his eyes and allowing consciousness to slip its moorings. Picture, if you will, the moment when day dissolves into twilight. That liminal hour when shadows grow long and the familiar world begins to shimmer with otherworldly possibility. This was Cayce's natural habitat, the space between waking and sleeping, between the known and the unknowable, between the personal, ego and the vast collective unconscious that Jung knew contained all of humanity's unspoken wisdom. When Cayce lay upon his worn leather couch, something profound occurred. His photographer's eye, trained to capture the visible world, turned inward, becoming a lens for visions that transcended ordinary time. The rational mind, that great gatekeeper of consensus reality, would simply step aside. And in that gentle abdication, the psyche's deeper layers began to speak, like the oracle at Delphi, who breathed sacred vapors and spoke prophecy from the earth's depths. Cayce became a conduit for information that existed beyond individual knowing. His consciousness would descend into what Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast underground river of ancestral memory, archetypal patterns, and future possibilities that flows beneath all human experience. But here was the terrible beauty of his gift. What flowed through him were not comforting platitudes or gentle reassurances. Instead, he glimpsed America's shadow, the dark underbelly of a nation drunk on progress and blind to its own contradictions. His visions carried the weight of mythic inevitability, the sense that certain patterns, once set in motion, must play themselves out to completion. The sleeping prophet had awakened to America's dreaming mind, and what he found there would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about our destiny. In the great mythology of consciousness, every prophet must first be broken open by the divine. The vessel must crack before the light can pour through. For Edgar Cayce, this sacred wounding began in childhood, when illness became the chisel that carved away the boundaries between worlds. The young boy lay fevered and delirious, his small body burning with a temperature that should have destroyed him. But instead of death, something far more mysterious occurred. In that liminal space between life and dissolution, his consciousness expanded beyond the confines of individual selfhood. The illness had fractured his ego's protective shell, creating fissures through which otherworldly wisdom could seep. Jung understood this paradox intimately, that our greatest gifts often emerge from our deepest wounds. The psyche, in its infinite wisdom, transforms our suffering into sacred medicine. What appears as breakdown becomes breakthrough. What feels like curse reveals itself as calling. The wounded healer archetype was being born in a Kentucky farmhouse, shaped by forces beyond human understanding. When sleep claimed the adult Cayce years later, that same dissolution would occur. His conscious mind would melt away like snow in spring, leaving only the vast receptive darkness of the unconscious. In this state of ego death, he became a hollow reed through which the collective knowledge of humanity could flow. His personal identity would dissolve entirely, making space for voices that spoke from the Akashic records themselves, that invisible library where every human thought, emotion, and future possibility is eternally preserved. This was no mere psychic trick. This was the soul's response to unbearable limitation, the psyche's refusal to be contained within the narrow boundaries of individual consciousness. Through the portal of his sacred wound, Cayce accessed what Jung called the objective psyche, that deeper layer of reality where past, present, and future converge in eternal now. The sleeping prophet had learned to die consciously, again and again, so that something larger than himself could live through him. Through the doorway of Cayce's expanded consciousness, a vision began to emerge that would challenge everything America believed about itself. Not the shining city on a hill, not the promised land of endless possibility, but something far more complex and troubling. A nation carrying within its collective psyche a shadow so vast and dark that it would eventually demand recognition through catastrophe. Jung taught us that what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves does not simply disappear. Instead, it grows in the darkness, accumulating power until it can no longer be ignored. America, drunk on its own mythology of righteousness and progress, had been projecting its shadow outward for generations, seeing evil in external enemies, while remaining blind to the contradictions festering within its own soul. But the unconscious has its own intelligence, its own inexorable timing. Through Cayce's prophetic vision, the collective shadow of an entire civilization was beginning to stir, preparing to break through the carefully constructed facades of American innocence. He saw the fault lines running deeper than geology, psychological, fractures that would eventually split open, forcing the nation to confront what it had spent centuries denying. This was not punishment, but necessity. The psyche's drive toward wholeness is absolute and uncompromising. Just as the individual must face their personal shadow to achieve genuine transformation, so too must entire civilizations undergo this dark night of the soul. America's manifest destiny had reached its shadow phase, the inevitable moment when expansion meets contraction, when light encounters its own darkness, when the hero's journey demands descent into the underworld. Cayce glimpsed the archetypal patterns playing out on the stage of collective consciousness, the inflation of ego meeting its compensatory deflation, the one-sided pursuit of material, progress awakening its spiritual opposite, the repressed returning with volcanic force. These were not mere historical events, but mythic necessities, the soul of a nation being forced through the crucible of its own contradictions. The sleeping prophet had seen America's date with destiny, and it would not be gentle. In the deepest layers of Cayce's trance, a voice began to speak, not human, but older than humanity itself. It was the voice of the earth, the planetary consciousness that Jung glimpsed in his most profound visions, speaking through the sleeping prophet like wind through a canyon. And what she spoke was a lament that would shake the foundations of the modern world. The earth, in Cayce's prophetic understanding, was not the dead rock of materialist science, but a living, breathing organism. A cosmic mother whose body had become the stage for humanity's great drama of consciousness. For millennia, she had absorbed the projections of human unconsciousness, had borne the weight of civilizations that treated her as mere resource rather than sacred being. But now, through the prophet's expanded awareness, she was preparing to speak. The geological prophecies that flowed through Cayce were not mere predictions of tectonic activity. They were symptoms of a deeper psychological process. The earth herself was undergoing individuation, her own journey toward wholeness that would require the shattering of old patterns and the birth of new forms. He saw California breaking away from the mainland like a shadow, finally separating from the ego, the psychological process of differentiation playing out on a continental scale. The great earthquakes he prophesied were the earth's labor pains, the necessary convulsions that precede rebirth. Fault lines that mirror the fractures in America's collective psyche would rupture, forcing what had been repressed, deep underground, to finally surface. New lands would rise from oceanic depths as compensation for what would be lost. The psyche's eternal principle of balance asserting itself through geological transformation. Mountain ranges would shift like thoughts reorganizing in the collective mind. The very ground beneath America's feet would become unstable, reflecting the psychological instability of a civilization built on denial of its own shadow. The Earth was preparing to individuate, and humanity would be forced to evolve alongside her or perish in the attempt. From the depths of the collective unconscious, another elemental force began to stir in Cayce's visions. Water, that primordial symbol of the psyche's hidden depths, preparing to reclaim what humanity had claimed as its own. The rising seas, he prophesied, were not merely consequences of melting ice, but manifestations of something far more profound. The return of the repressed on a scale that would reshape the very coastlines of consciousness. Water, Jung knew, represents the unconscious in its most fluid and transformative aspect. It dissolves boundaries, erodes the rigid structures of ego consciousness, and carries within its depths all that has been forgotten or denied. Through Cayce's prophetic lens, the floods to come would serve as a great baptism, not gentle sprinkling, but total immersion, forcing America to confront what it had buried beneath layers of concrete and denial. The coastal cities, those temples to materialism where humanity had gathered to worship progress and accumulation, would find themselves swallowed by the very forces they had ignored. Wall Street's towers would stand like isolated monuments in rising waters, their glass facades reflecting not sky, but the dark depths of collective shadow made manifest. The seas would reclaim the land where indigenous peoples once lived in harmony, their ancient wisdom rising with the waters to teach what modernity had forgotten. This was not destruction, but purification, the oceanic unconscious asserting its primacy over the narrow confines of rational thought. Like the biblical flood that cleansed the world of its corruption, these waters would carry both endings and beginnings. What could not adapt to the new reality would be swept away, while seeds of transformation would be carried to higher ground. The rising waters represented democracy's unconscious finally breaking through its civilized constraints, demanding that America's shadow projections be withdrawn from distant enemies and faced within its own flooded cities. The cleansing had begun, and there would be no escape from the depths of what had been so long denied. But water alone could not complete the great work of transformation. From the cosmic depths of Cayce's visions came another force, fire descending from celestial realms, not as meteorites or earthly flame, but as pure solar consciousness. Electromagnetic fury that would strip away the final veils of human illusion. This was the fire that purifies what water cannot reach, burning through the dense matter of materialist thinking to touch the soul itself. The sleeping prophet saw great solar storms erupting from the sun's corona, like thoughts breaking free from the collective unconscious. These electromagnetic tempests would overwhelm Earth's protective magnetosphere as easily as truth overwhelms self-deception. Technology, that great pride of Western civilization, would become humanity's Achilles heel, each device a potential gateway for cosmic fire to enter and transform. Jung understood this as enantiodromia on a galactic scale, the psyche's tendency to swing toward its opposite when one-sidedness becomes extreme. America's technological hubris, its faith in machines over spirit, would meet its celestial shadow in waves of pure energy that care nothing for human constructions. Satellites would fall silent like prayers in empty churches. Power grids would collapse like neural networks overwhelmed by revelation. The very infrastructure of modern life would become kindling for a fire that burns in dimensions beyond the physical. This solar initiation represented the transcendent function breaking through, that miraculous process by which consciousness leaps beyond its current limitations into entirely new configurations of being. The electromagnetic pulses were not random solar events, but evolutionary pressure from the cosmos itself, forcing humanity to develop new organs of perception, new ways of being that could survive in frequencies of reality previously unimaginable. The fire from heaven would circumcise human consciousness. cutting away the foreskin of false beliefs that had covered the tender flesh of authentic spiritual awareness. What emerged from this cosmic baptism by fire would no longer be merely human, but something unprecedented. Homo cosmicus, awakened to its true place in the living universe. In the deepest chambers of prophetic vision, Cayce witnessed the death of money itself, not as currency but as God, as the false deity that had captured America's soul and held it prisoner within towers of paper and promises. The economic collapse he foresaw was not mere recession or market correction, but complete alchemical dissolution, the Negredo phase of collective transformation where all solid structures turn to primum materia. Like a caterpillar entering its chrysalis, the entire economic organism would need to dissolve into an undifferentiated soup of possibility before something entirely new could emerge. The banks, those cathedrals of materialism where Americans had deposited their dreams and mortgaged their futures, would reveal themselves as temples to an illusion. Numbers on screens that had somehow convinced an entire civilization to trade their birthright for electronic phantoms. This was not punishment but metamorphosis. The psyche's drive toward authenticity was finally asserting itself against the collective persona of endless growth and accumulation. What Jung called the transcendent function was preparing to birth a new form of exchange, one based not on scarcity and competition, but on the recognition of fundamental interconnection. The collapse would strip away the financial scaffolding that had held the old consciousness in place, forcing Americans to rediscover forms of wealth that could not be digitized or manipulated. Community bonds, creative skills, spiritual wisdom, and the capacity for genuine relationship. The homeless would become teachers of simplicity. The dispossessed would possess what money could never buy, freedom from the golden chains of consumer identity. In the chrysalis darkness of economic dissolution, new organs of perception would begin to form. Systems of exchange based on gift, rather than transaction, abundance rather than scarcity, being rather than having. The death of the old economy would birth forms of prosperity that nourish the soul rather than depleting it. From the decomposing matter of American capitalism, something beautiful and unprecedented was preparing to take wing. Through Cayce's expanded consciousness, the deepest wound in America's political psyche began to reveal itself, not as external threat or ideological division, but as the massive projection of its own unlived potential onto convenient enemies. The sleeping prophet saw democracy itself entering its dark night of the soul, where all the shadows it had cast upon foreign shores would return like prodigal children demanding recognition and integration. The two-party system, that great engine of division which had kept Americans locked in eternal opposition, would reveal itself as the ego's desperate attempt to maintain artificial wholeness through splitting. Like a person who sees only good in themselves by projecting all evil onto others, American politics had become a theater of shadow projection on a civilizational scale. Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, these were not true differences, but complementary aspects of a single psyche split against itself. Jung understood that what we most despise in others often represents our own unlived life, our rejected potentials crying out for integration. The political crisis Cayce envisioned was democracy's individuation process, the painful recognition that the enemy was never external but internal, never them but us, never there but here. The authoritarian tendencies Americans feared in distant dictators lived within their own hearts. The corruption they denounced in foreign governments mirrored their own systemic decay. This recognition would shatter the comfortable illusion of American innocence, like a mirror struck by truth. Political parties would dissolve like salt in water as citizens awakened to the recognition that division itself had become the enemy. The real work was not defeating opponents, but integrating opposites, not conquering darkness, but wedding it. to light. From this political crucifixion, a new form of governance would emerge, not based on the violent oscillation between extremes, but on the dynamic tension of conscious paradox. Democracy would evolve beyond the primitive mechanisms of projection and blame into something unprecedented, a system capable of holding contradiction without collapse, complexity without chaos. The shadow integration had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. From the ashes of collapsed systems, Cayce perceived a phoenix of unprecedented beauty rising. Technology transformed from instrument of domination into ally of the soul. The same inventive genius that had created weapons of mass destruction would birth technologies of mass awakening, devices that worked not against the natural order, but in harmony with the subtle frequencies that govern all life. This was technology's own shadow integration, the marriage of silicon and spirit, circuitry and consciousness. Where once machines had been designed to exploit and extract, now they would heal and harmonize. The sleeping prophet saw healing devices that read the body's energy signature like sheet music, translating illness back into the harmony from which it had fallen. Diagnostic tools that perceived not just symptoms, but their archetypal roots in the psyche's depths. Communication would transcend the crude limitations of words and screens. Cayce glimpsed technologies that transmitted not just information, but actual states of consciousness, devices that could share the felt experience of love, wisdom, or profound peace as easily as current phones share photographs. The isolation that had plagued modern humanity would dissolve as hearts learned to speak directly to hearts across any distance. Energy itself would be liberated from the tyranny of scarcity. The zero-point field, that ocean of pure potential, that Jung intuited as the pleroma, the fullness from which all manifestation arises, would become humanity's inexhaustible power source. No more wars over oil, no more poisoning of rivers for coal, no more nuclear shadows haunting the collective unconscious. These technologies would emerge not through aggressive research, but through receptive attunement. Scientists becoming more like mystics, opening themselves to frequencies of knowledge that existed before human thought. The inventions would arrive like gifts from the cosmos itself, requiring not conquest, but collaboration with the living intelligence that pervades all existence. The healing frequency was beginning to broadcast, and those with ears to hear would receive transmissions that would transform technology from humanity's shadow into its luminous companion on the journey home. In the depths of his prophetic trance, Cayce perceived souls of extraordinary luminosity choosing to incarnate during America's Great Tribulation. Not as victims of catastrophe, but as conscious midwives of transformation. These were the children of the new dispensation, beings whose very nervous systems had been designed by cosmic intelligence to bridge the gap between the dying world and the one being born. Like the mythic divine child who appears when the old king must die, they carried, within their cellular memory, the archetypal patterns needed for humanity's next evolutionary leap. Their DNA held frequencies of consciousness that their parents could barely comprehend, genetic codes written in languages of light that would only activate when the external chaos reached its crescendo. These children would not fit the molds of conventional education or societal expectation. Their minds would process information in spirals rather than lines. Their hearts would ache with an inexplicable longing for a world that existed only in potential. Teachers would call them difficult. Doctors would diagnose them as disordered. But their apparent dysfunction was actually hyperfunctional. Consciousness trying to operate beyond the limitations of obsolete paradigms. They would be naturally telepathic, intuitively understanding the web of connection that links all beings. Authority based on domination would be meaningless to them, for they would recognize only the authority of love and truth. The artificial divisions that had kept their parents separated, race, nationality, religion, class, would seem as absurd to them as believing the earth is flat. In their eyes would shine the light of integrated wholeness, shadow and light dancing together in conscious harmony. They would not need to undergo the painful individuation process of their ancestors, for they would arrive already individuated, already whole, already aware of their cosmic citizenship. These children were evolution's answer to humanity's crisis, living proof that consciousness itself was preparing to make an unprecedented leap. Through their innocence, ancient wisdom would return. Through their play, sacred technologies would be discovered. Through their love, the world would remember what it had forgotten. In the deepest archaeology of Cayce's visions, layers of time folded upon themselves like geological strata, revealing America's crisis as an echo of ancient catastrophe. The fall of Atlantis, resonating across millennia like a cosmic bell struck once, but heard forever. This was not mere historical repetition, but the soul's inexorable drive to complete what had been left unfinished, to heal wounds that transcended individual lifetimes. The sleeping prophet perceived Atlantis not as a lost continent, but as a previous experiment in consciousness, humanity's first attempt to marry spirit and matter, technology and wisdom, power and love. That civilization had achieved heights of material mastery that made modern science seem primitive. But their spiritual development had not kept pace with their technological prowess. The shadow of unchecked power had eventually consumed them, sinking their continent beneath waves of their own making. Now, through the lens of karma, that cosmic law of cause and effect that operates across eons, the same souls who had participated in Atlantis's destruction were returning to face the same essential choice. Would they repeat the ancient pattern of spiritual inflation leading to catastrophic fall? Or would they finally learn to integrate power with wisdom, technology with love, progress with reverence for the sacred? America had become the stage where this ancient drama was playing its final act. The same archetypal forces that had destroyed the first great technological civilization were stirring again. The temptation to play God without becoming godlike, to wield cosmic forces without cosmic consciousness. The atomic bomb, genetic, manipulation, artificial intelligence. These were the modern equivalents of Atlantean technologies that had once torn holes in the fabric of reality itself. But this time, the outcome was not predetermined. The karmic wheel had turned full circle, offering consciousness a chance to choose differently. The children of light incarnating during these times carried cellular memories of both Atlantis's glory and its tragedy, living bridges between what was and what could be. The ancient wound was preparing to heal at last. In the ultimate depths of prophetic vision, Cayce glimpsed the secret hidden within all the catastrophes. That every disaster was a birth pang, every collapse a contraction, in the labor of a new form of consciousness struggling to be born. America's trials were not endings but beginnings, not punishments but initiations in service of an evolutionary leap that would transform not just a nation, but the entire species. This was the great secret that mystics had whispered across millennia. The consciousness itself evolves, that awareness grows and develops just as bodies do, and that what appears as destruction is often creation in disguise. The sleeping prophet had seen beyond the veil of appearances to perceive the true nature of the transformation. Sudden, total, irreversible, like the moment when the chrysalis finally splits and the butterfly emerges, dripping with the fluids of metamorphosis. The awakening would not be comfortable or gradual, but instantaneous and overwhelming, a collective kundalini rising that would shatter every assumption about what it means to be human. In a single moment that stretched across years, millions of minds would remember their cosmic origin, their divine nature, their fundamental interconnection with all life. The illusion of separation that had driven humanity to the brink of self-destruction would dissolve like salt in an ocean of unified consciousness. America, that great experiment in individual freedom, would discover that true freedom lay not in separation, but in conscious unity. Not the unity of conformity, but the unity of infinite diversity expressing itself through countless unique forms. The nation would become what it had always been destined to become. Not a political entity, but a catalyst for humanity's spiritual evolution. A laboratory where the future of consciousness would be written in letters of living light. The sleeping. Prophet's ultimate message echoed across time like a bell struck in eternity. The darkness was not coming to destroy, but to give birth, and what would emerge from America's crucible would illuminate the path for all humanity's return to its divine inheritance.